Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Skype sessions. Now, here on Pints with Jack, we primarily focus on Jack, on C.S. Lewis. But if you've been listening to us for a while, you'll know that we regularly like to take trips out to look at Lewis's influences. People like G.K. Chesterton, Dorothy Sayers, and particularly fellow Inklings. And we've had Owen Barfield Month and Tolkien Month, and we've done some crossovers with people like the Tolkien Road and the Prancing Pony. And I really feel it's time that we return to the world of Tolkien, because really, unless you've been hiding under a rock, there's been a lot happening there recently. So to talk us through what's been happening and answering the question, should we be afraid, is Matt. Matt from Nerd of the Rings. Matt, welcome to the show.
Well, thanks so much for having me, David. I'm excited to chat with you today.
Well, would you mind just introducing yourself to our viewers? Who are you?
Yeah, absolutely. So my name is Matt. I run a YouTube channel called Nerd of the Rings. I've been doing that for about 2.5 years since I started that. And I cover all kinds of lore. One thing that I'd say I'm known for, or as a trademark of my channel, is I do a lot with the maps of Tolkien's Middle Earth and charting travels and trying to point out the significance of the geography of the events going on and the characters as they move throughout Middle Earth. In addition, we do some fun things like live streams, and then also some what if videos. So like, what if Gandalf got the One Ring? So delightfully nerdy, where I went through and actually calculated travel times to different locations, and it was very in-depth. A very in-depth rabbit hole to go down. But yeah, and then obviously, like you mentioned, we've got an Amazon show coming up, The Rings of Power. We've got an anime, War of the Rohirrim, that's coming out in 2024, I believe is the date, and some video games too. So I definitely, as a fellow Narnia fan, I am also a Narnia fan. I definitely feel for the ones who are primarily Narnia fans, because it feels like we're getting a lot of stuff right now from the Tolkien perspective, and Narnia not so much.
Yes, but could that be a good thing? We will definitely talk about Netflix and Narnia towards the end. But before that, let's talk about the Rings of Power.
Yeah.
We'd heard rumblings of this for a long, long time from Amazon, and we've started seeing promotional materials, and the audience reaction has been, we'll call it mixed.
Yes.
We have some people who are losing their minds.
Yeah.
And not in a good way. I know at least one person that is now officially boycotting Amazon at all. He says, I now shop at Walmart online. That's how I get everything. They're going to ruin this. I hate them. So you've sort of got that on one end. And on the other end, you've got people that are just super enthusiastic about the stuff that's happening. And you have the spectrum in the middle, including myself, who I would just say slightly worried. I don't think it's going to, I'm not saying it's going to be terrible yet. We definitely haven't seen enough, and so you can't really judge it. But I will admit I'm a little concerned, and primarily because in the promotional materials, we've seen a lot of new characters, people that aren't actually part of the Legendarium. They're the ones that have been created by the show and used as vehicles for telling stories. And while they obviously have to do some of that, because they're basically basing this off the appendices, and there's only so much to go on, it does worry me that I'm seeing a lot more emphasis on that rather than the stuff that Tolkien actually wrote.
Yeah.
And that, coupled with the fact that I've had quite a few franchises over the last decade or two that I'm not going to quite say ruined, but I now don't really care about what's happening in Star Wars.
Right.
I used to be a Trekkie. I don't really care anymore, and my love for Marvel is rapidly coming to an end. So when I'm looking at the Tolkien world, I absolutely love the Peter Jackson movies. The Hobbit got progressively worse every movie, and now we've got this thing coming out, and I'm just a little scared. Is this going to be the thing that's going to kill it, or will this be the thing that is going to revive it? And so those are my thoughts. But you had the opportunity to go to London and speak to some of the showrunners and see stuff that the rest of us mere mortals haven't seen. So, what are your thoughts about the Rings of Power?
Um, so I am definitely in the middle. You kind of laid out the two extremes there. Um, I'm one who has always said since day one of starting my channel, I've got concerns, I've got hopes, but I'm gonna wait until I actually see it. I just refuse to judge a show before I've actually seen it. It just seems hasty, to borrow a line from Treebeard,
Don't be hasty.
to do so at this point. So yeah, so I'm not about to boycott an entire company over a show that hasn't been released yet. Yeah, so I'd say, even from when they announced it, there's definitely the I understand, there's been history of franchises not, delivering what fans want or expect. So I do understand where that comes from. As far as your question of, will this sink the franchise or will it revive it? I think it has a better chance of, I don't even know if I would say revive, because I feel like the Lord of the Rings, especially the Peter Jackson trilogy, has such a longevity to it, even 20 years later. But I do think that this could just be the first of potentially many Middle Earth projects to come. I don't necessarily hope they come in the quantities of Disney or Marvel, because those I've kind of gotten a little bit of overload with Star Wars and Marvel projects there. I think we're probably in the same boat on that. There's just so much, and like I would rather have occasional shows and movies that are really good than just a steady stream that are so. Yeah, so I have hopes for the show. I think what we've seen so far, the marketing material, Numenor looks really good.
Actually, probably we should pause a moment for people that haven't actually been consuming this stuff in too much detail. What is the scope of this show? Where does this fit in? Let's say someone has only seen the Peter Jackson movies. What is this show going to cover, and what can people expect?
Yes. So this, if you've only seen the Peter Jackson movies, this will take place at least 3,000 years before the events of the Lord of the Rings. There's some time compression going on. So this is the Second Age, and there's some time compression going on. We're not 100% sure how that's going to play out in the show. But this comes in the age before the Lord of the Rings. So if you remember from the prologue of Fellowship of the Ring with the War of the Last Alliance, and we had Elrond and Elendil, and that's when Isildur cuts the ring from Sauron's hand. Spoiler alert, that should be basically the finale of this show here in 5 years or so when season 5 gets around, because that's how the Second Age ends. Yeah, so kind of the main storylines that we're going to see are the creation of the Rings of Power. So we've got the 9 for men, the 7 for dwarves, 3 for the elves, and of course the One Ring. Sauron wages war against the elves, and he also has some very sneaky activities in order to take down the realm of Numenor, which the Numenorians are the ancestors of Aragorn. And in the extended version of the Two Towers, I believe it's in the extended version, where Aragorn confesses that he's 87 years old because he's of Numenorian descent. And so this is those peoples who live longer than mere mortal men. So those are, and then obviously we have the War of the Last Alliance, which is kind of where everything comes to a head and everyone stands up to Sauron in a last ditch effort to stop him from conquering the lands, basically. So yeah, there's a lot of big moments, but like you alluded to, these are adapted primarily from the appendices, which are notes. And there's a handful of bits of dialogue that we have, but definitely not the quantity of the Lord of the Rings, where Peter Jackson could pull entire paragraphs of dialogue if he so chose to. So that, yeah, there's going to be a lot of stuff, that's created original for this show. And that's where I think, a lot of the success or failure of the show is going to, hinge upon how they do with all of that.
Now, one of the things that,
and to answer your earlier question, sorry. I was gonna say, to answer your earlier question of, or you mentioned there's been a lot of original characters in the promotional material, and that's actually been one of my biggest hesitancies about it, because as a book fan, I see a lot of original characters, and I just, to put it bluntly, I just don't care that much. Like, I don't have much reason to care. Now, the show could come out and created characters. You could really enjoy them. They could, the invented elf Arondir is one who, he does that one move in one of the teasers where he catches an arrow out of the air, flips it around, and shoots it back. I'm like, okay, pretty that's cool. Kind of a cool, like, Legolas moment, like I could get on board with that. But, book fans, I feel like, are always going to want to know, okay, so how are you, how's Galadriel going to be portrayed? How's Elrond going to be portrayed? And Celebrimbor is a big one that's very, very important in this story. And Gil-galad, the High King of the Noldor. So here lately, I'd say over the last couple weeks, we've gotten more about canon characters, which has been encouraging. It's not, like I said, it's not, I'm still going to be hanging out in the middle until I see it. But knowing that there's some real canon thought and intentionality definitely is better than not having that out there, for sure.
Absolutely. And I initially pulled a face the first time I saw the cast list, because I saw Lenny Henry was playing. We're not calling them hobbits, we're calling them half-foots for legal reasons. But Lenny Henry is playing a hobbit, and I grew up watching him as a comedian. And I thought, that's a weird choice. And then I realized, well, actually, the guy that played Bilbo in the Hobbit movies, I grew up watching him as a comedy character, and actually, I thought he was probably one of the best parts of those movies.
Yeah.
So I had to check my my immediate cynicism. But one of the complaints that I've seen relates to Galadriel, because people are saying, "Oh, this is a very different kind of Galadriel." Well, she was also several thousand years younger, so that seems reasonable to me. And I would say a lot of the complaints that people are seeing from either imagery that they've seen or whatever, none of them for me are showstoppers. It's sometimes like, that's a little strange, but virtually all of these things can still work. It really is just going to come down to the execution.
Right. Yeah. And I think, there's definitely, like you said, there's so many people, or at least there appears to be so many people on one extreme or the other. I think, honestly, they just happen to be the loudest, not necessarily the representative of the highest number of folks. And I think there's also, probably some baggage from other adaptations that people have seen in the past. So they see a warrior Galadriel and they make assumptions on what that means. And maybe it's accurate, maybe it's not. My point is we don't know at this point. But I don't think that, warrior Galadriel is 100% a canon breaking thing. What we are told is that Galadriel is extremely prideful, and part of the reason that she makes the exile with the Noldor, it's this great line, and I can't remember it exactly, but it talks about how much of a grudge she holds against Feanor. And basically she goes in order to thwart him any way that she can, which I mean is pretty hot-headed. So like when they said, Galadriel's kind of a hothead, I'm like, oh, that's not necessarily outright false. Now, I think you could make the argument that Galadriel probably would have started mellowing out in the First Age when she spends time with Melian in Doriath. So, timeline wise, there's probably some some finagling there. I think, this is all behind the scenes theoretical stuff too. Like, it doesn't say like she hung out with Melian, now she's like super chill, So yeah, but I don't think that, Galadriel being more assertive or, more aggressive is necessarily like 100% a canon breaker. Now, does it say outright that she was a warrior leading armies? No, it doesn't say that outright. So, I mean, there's going to be some creative license taken with the show, and I, for one, have always known that. So it didn't rub me as badly as it has some.
I actually view it as almost hopeful because we are going to be initially getting it seeming a very different kind of Galadriel. That means there's a character arc.
Yes, exactly.
And we haven't had that in certain properties recently. So when you were talking about this warrior princess, effectively, there are two movies that jump into my head: Captain Marvel and Wonder Woman. I love one of these and I hate the other.
I have a feeling I have the same opinion.
and the very fact that you see a character arc in one and I don't think you really see anything in the other is what made one of those movies really good and one not. So the very fact that we're getting a different Galadriel, actually, I'm viewing that one as a positive.
Yeah. And honestly, like I don't know if I've actually said this. I might have said it on a live stream at some point, but I honestly think there is potential for a very interesting arc for Galadriel in her starting out as a warrior, because we know how she ends. So by the end of the show, we know what she's got to be by that time. So at some point, she is going to opt to set aside her armor and become the more ethereal, and I would argue more of a protector than an aggressor. And I think that maybe Celeborn and their daughter Celebrian maybe might come into play there. I think that would be really interesting as well. But it would be unique, I would say, in today's movie trends for, a strong female character to come to the realization that, it's very similar to Éowyn, honestly. Like if you go into the books, Éowyn at the end of the day, they didn't have this in the films, but at the end of the day, Éowyn realizes that what she truly wants is not glory and battle. Granted, she had already achieved it, so I mean, there's that. But
you kill the Witch King. You've kind of done everything on that list,
right? Yeah. So she kind of checked it off the list already. But she has some, the whole conversation with her and Faramir is beautiful, and I feel like with Galadriel, there's an opportunity for her to, instead of valuing revenge against Sauron, to value protecting her people. And for her, initially she went to Middle Earth wanting to rule a realm and be a queen. And for her to get to the point where when she could conceivably call herself Queen of Lorien, she doesn't. She's known as the Lady of Lorien, not the Queen. Like they purposely do not take the title of King and Queen. It's Lord and Lady. So yeah, I think for all the kind of freaking out over Galadriel, I feel like there could actually be a really good arc for her.
That's reassuring.
Or
that
there could not be.
I mean, it could be terrible.
Who knows?
but the fact that some of that resonates with you makes me very happy, because that's probably the bit that I'm most hopeful about. That people are freaking out. I think we could actually turn around and say, you know what? No, they did it really, really well. Now, I want to talk about one other thing that I'm a little bit worried about. and then we'll talk about Netflix. And the thing that I'm a little worried about is the time compression.
Yeah.
I am fairly new to anything that happened prior to the Third Age. I am now on my second read through of the Silmarillion. I read through it last year, and I'm going through it again now. And it seems to me that one of the major things to deal with in those earlier ages is the difference between men and elves. The fact that the elves are kicking around for centuries, millennia.
Yeah.
And the men, they come, they go, and the whole transient nature of their existence and bigger questions about death.
Yeah.
And there's been certainly talk in the Rings of Power that they are compressing the timeline. And I've basically heard nothing but good reports about the showrunners, the fact that they really know their lore, they know good stuff. But that one does kind of concern me, because if you're going to compress the timeline, you're not going to be able to deal with those elements anywhere near as easily. You know, they dealt with that difference with, say, with Aragorn, the fact that he was going to be marrying somebody that was immortal. He was going to grow old and die, even if that was going to take a long time. But that separation was going to happen. So it is possible without having an extended timeline. But I think it's just going to be much, much harder.
Yeah. I totally agree. Yeah, honestly, time compression is still my number one concern. Initially, it was, when they announced it, and as rumors were flying around, my greatest concern was that they would make it like Game of Thrones with all kinds of gratuitous nonsense, and but that's been refuted directly. Like that was one of the things that the showrunners told us in London was absolutely not. Like they feel like the world is ready for a more hopeful and, I don't know if they use the term wholesome, but like, they think that, audiences are ready, for
a little bit of hope
post Game of Thrones, like not this gloom and doom and like,
even if it's just a fool's hope,
violence and even if it's just fool's hope. So yeah, time compression though. That's one thing that I still am very nervous about, because like you said, the difference between men and elves and mortality versus immortality is kind of at the crux of everything in the Second Age. So there's the obvious where you have the Númenóreans, while they live, for a couple hundred years at least, in their later days, it's still nothing compared to the elves. And the fact that generations of Númenóreans come and go while Gil-galad is still High King of the Noldor, Elrond's still around, Galadriel's still around. So there's no perceivable change in them, but you have generations of men coming and going. Eventually, that is what drives Númenor to darkness and to its downfall. So, from what we've seen of the show, it seems like, all the players are in place, in season 1 that are going to be there in season 5 finale. So over a single lifespan of a Númenórean man, this whole show is going to take place. And that's just such a huge compression. And I feel like, I just am very, very curious to see how they attempt to tell that story without the benefit of seeing Númenórean kings come and go. I feel like that would have been really compelling if there was some separation there. And, they said, well, we'd be casting human characters every season or two. Yeah. And I say, great, do that. Go ahead. You have my permission to do that. Add some excitement to casting in between seasons. Like, that sounds great. Do that, please. So yeah, I don't know. They seem confident that they've worked out a way to portray that. But I'm still not sold. And even from the elves, so that's the more obvious one. Even the elves, the fact that the world is in a state of decay gradually through the ages while they linger is the whole reason that Celebrimbor falls for the Rings of Power scheme of creating these Rings of Power, because he's promised that they can forestall the decays of time. And that's why Rivendell and Lorien are these wonderfully beautiful realms that seem completely otherworldly when you read through Lord of the Rings, and the descriptions of like the Hobbit characters and what they experience there. It's very obvious that it does not feel like any other place in Middle Earth, and that's because with their rings of power, they're able to preserve these realms. So that is what's promised to Celebrimbor by Sauron in his disguised form of Anatar. So even the mortality of elves is not the outright blessing that the men think it is.
Yeah.
It also leads the elves themselves into foolishness. So all that to say, compressing all of that into maybe 100 years or so is definitely one of those things that, as a book fan, I'm a little nervous about, for sure.
It worries me, but I am also really curious as to, I mean, I think you laid it out really nicely, why time is important in this story, and they're going to have to find some other way of doing it, or at the very least communicating much more of this in dialogue rather than us actually seeing the passage of time. Well, viewers, if you have followed us this far and you've managed to make it through all of the various funny names that Matt has been pronouncing, let's move on to more familiar territory for more of our viewers. Let's talk Narnia. As we said, Lord of the Rings has been getting everything. Video games, animation, new series, and all of us Narnians are sitting here twiddling our thumbs wondering what Netflix is doing. Because they have been sitting on that property for, I think, at least 4 years now. And I remember speaking to Douglas Gresham, C.S. Lewis's stepson, after they made the sale, and we were at a conference, and we asked him if he'd heard anything, what they were planning, and he said he had no idea. And there don't really seem to have been many more details that have come out. So we're kind of in limbo, which, looking at some Tolkien fans losing their mind, I suppose this must be a blessing. But it also means that we get to wildly speculate. And that's the kind of speculation I like. I like it to be pretty wild. And so I just wondered, from your own experience of seeing the Rings of Power, if you were going to be doing the Chronicles of Narnia and you were Netflix, how would you do it in such a way that you get as many people on board as possible to make it as big a success as possible? What would you do?
The one thing, so I will say, like I mentioned earlier, I am also a Narnia fan. I've been turning my kids on to the books, and they've been reading through them and loving them and everything. So that's really fun. I do occasionally, like every few months or so, I try to remember to tweet at Netflix to like the gif of the guy poking something with a stick saying do something. And then I just hashtag Narnia it, because it's kind of ridiculous how many years it's been listed on like their annual things in development that they post, and Narnia is always on there. And I'm like, dude, you're not doing anything. Come on, do something. I do think Netflix is interesting, and they're in an interesting time in their company because they're not dominating like they used to.
No.
But gosh, I feel like Narnia is one of those family friendly, whether it's movies or series, that could be really big if they did it right.
And they could also learn from a lot of the mistakes that Walden Media made, particularly with regards to marketing, because Walden, they had great success with The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, and they just thought, oh, this is the next Lord of the Rings. We don't have to do anything now. And so that was when there were real issues with Prince Caspian. And then after fewer people have seen that, then they got very creative with
Dawn Treader.
Voyage of the Dawn Treader, and that was just a nightmare. They also have, they have, a black box that they can look at and see how it crashed and burned before.
Right. Yeah. And I think, I do think there is some merit to doing a series versus films. I personally prefer films. Like, I like the experience of, sitting down. Obviously I have no problem sitting down for a long time because I'm huge on the Lord of the Rings extended editions. But what Disney and Amazon and all these places have done is they've done, what was the traditional broadcast method of one episode per week instead of the binge that Netflix still does. And I think it helps these shows to stay in conversation longer. Whereas, Netflix does a dump of the whole season and they just get all this conversation for a week or so, and then people move on to the next thing. Whereas, you have The Mandalorian come out, and every week we're talking about The Mandalorian and guessing what's happening the next week. So I think, if they were to start doing more of their shows in that method, that would probably help them as a company, period. But yeah, I would enjoy it either way if they did. I mean, any of the options that you named, whether it's films or a series or animated or whatever, like, do something with it. It feels like it's not like people need to realize that it's not the Lord of the Rings. It's not the exact same. It's not the same demographic. Like, don't try to make it into something that it's not. And, hopefully they get someone producing it that understands what it is, what it isn't. And I think if they do it, faithfully, if they, it doesn't have to be the biggest, like Rings of Power, for example, like the number $1 billion has been thrown out a lot. And it's like,
yeah,
okay, like that's how much you got at stake on this thing. Like, it still has to be good. Like, so yeah, and like it doesn't have to compete with that, like to be good. Like, that doesn't mean anything. The numbers, So yeah, I hope that they eventually do something. I would love it. I think, just for the marketing impact, starting with Lion, Witch, and the Wardrobe might make the most sense because it's the most popular.
See, there I actually have. This is probably my most contentious opinion about Netflix and Narnia. I am a diehard. You read Narnia in publication order when you first read it. You have to start with The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, and then go through in publication order. But the thing is, we've seen multiple versions of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. And so I actually think it might even be better if they actually did it in chronological order. If we start with The Magician's Nephew. And we begin with the creation of Narnia and give people something different that they haven't seen before. Because I could see lots of people who are semi-fans. It's like, oh, I've seen this before. I'm not really that interested. Whereas, hey, do you want to see a story that you haven't actually never seen before anywhere?
Yeah.
Right, so I'm actually willing to make that concession. They would have to change some things, which is fine.
Yeah.
But I think that could work. And I thoroughly agree with you.
Lion, Witch, and the Wardrobe would be second, right? I'm a little hazy on my chronological order. Yeah.
It would then be Lion, Witch, and the Wardrobe. You could then put in The Horse and His Boy at that point. You then do Prince Caspian.
Love The Horse and His Boy, actually.
That's
one of my favorites. Is it really?
Yeah.
I love that one. Oh, man. Yeah, I used to listen to the was it Focus on the Family that did like audio dramas? Yes. I love those things.
Superb.
They're really good.
And your point about not needing to compete with the Rings of Power and Game of Thrones, etc., I would absolutely agree with that. It doesn't need to be huge. I grew up on the BBC versions of the Chronicles of Narnia when they came out on TV. I am that old.
Yeah,
and I absolutely loved it. And I think if you could just do something in a similar sort of spirit, I think it would find an audience. And I actually think it could be a very cost-effective series to produce, given the interest in Narnia. I don't think you need to drop $1 billion to make a really good series that's faithful to the book, and which will then inevitably be well received by fans.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think I'd like to think that, studios are kind of wisening up, if that's a word. They're getting wise to, the fact that of what fans actually care about and want versus, what they can see as smoke and mirrors. So yeah, I would love to see a Narnia series or movies. Like I said, I like movies too, but.
And to move things back into the Tolkien world, I think people would have been far happier with The Hobbit had it been a smaller movie. But there was this effort to make it much bigger, and I think that was its downfall. If they could have kept it smaller, I think it would have been far better received. But then again, you can't charge people the cost of entry for 3 different movies.
Right. Right. Yeah. I think, there's essentially a documentary's worth of tales about what went wrong with the Hobbit films. And not all of it, like I think in the early days, a lot of people pointed toward Peter Jackson for it. And I think in the years since, it's
I think
been
he has
pretty
been
darn
mostly
clear
vindicated.
yes, I think he's been pretty well vindicated that, this was not his train wreck. And
he was just the driver at the end.
right. It came down to, either Peter Jackson was going to direct it or the studio was going to pull the plug and all the people in New Zealand would be out of the jobs that they were counting on, and Peter seems like a good guy. So he was, of those two options, like I would have done the same thing. Like, okay, we'll do our best, Yeah. But speaking of the Hobbit, talking about original characters and stuff, I actually don't think Tauriel is nearly as bad as she gets, hate for, with the exception of the love triangle. Like, and
Absolutely.
ironically enough, like, from what we've seen, and heard over the years, that was part of the arrangement between, Peter Jackson and Evangeline Lilly, was that she wouldn't be part of a love triangle. And then the studio said, you need to put a love story in this. And that's how we ended up with a love triangle. So if Peter Jackson would have been left to do it the way he would have, then I think Tauriel would have been a pretty awesome character, honestly. Yeah, I could go on, I could go on and on about, we could really get on a tangent with the Hobbit, with the Hobbit movies.
Well, rather than going down another tangent, why don't you tell our viewers where they can find all of your videos so they can hear all of your other opinions, strongly felt and lightly held.
Right. Yes. That's a great term. Yeah, I think that's pretty accurate. So yeah, it's on YouTube, youtube.com/nerd of the rings. And I'm also on Twitter and Instagram. I don't, I'm not as involved in those other platforms. YouTube's my main thing, but yeah, there's all kinds of Tolkien lore. So if if you're getting bored, you've been twiddling your thumbs for a while, waiting for Netflix, and you think, maybe I'll learn about Middle Earth a little bit, you can swing on by and we'll take care of you.
Wonderful stuff. Matt, thanks for coming on the show.
Yeah, thanks so much, David.
And viewers, please join us next time when we'll continue going further up and further in. Cheers.